What's the worst advice you've ever given? I told my older sister to touch grass, and it ruined her life. It all started when she stopped showering for days on end. She wore the same hoodie for 7 days straight until the hallway outside her room started smelling like a gym locker. When I mentioned it to Mom, she just sighed. "We're doing what the doctors recommended. You need to trust us." Dad was even stranger, adding, "Some things have to run their course." I couldn't sleep one night and found her in the hallway at 2 a.m., illuminated by her phone screen. "Kesha, Dad said lights out at 10, I whispered. "Just 5 more minutes." That's when Dad appeared in the doorway. "Kesha, we've talked about this." She barely acknowledged him, and I noticed her hands were shaking. When I woke up the next morning, she was gone. No clothes in the closet, no posters on the walls, even the sheets were stripped. I ran downstairs to find Mom calmly making breakfast. "Where is she?" I demanded. "Your sister needed serious help," she said, keeping her voice low. "So we sent her to a facility to help her get better." I was just 11 at the time and assumed my parents knew best, so I went about life as normal. And after 2 months, Kesha finally came home. When I ran to hug her, she just stood there tensed up with her eyes completely glossed over. She was ghost white, and her eyes were constantly scanning the room like a trapped animal. "Hello, my dear sister," she said, her voice flat and mechanical. My dad led her up to her bedroom, and she went straight to sleep. While she slept, my dad took her door off the hinges. She had to wear gloves at all times so she couldn't touch anyone. They even installed a bell on her ankle that jingled when she walked. When I asked my parents why they couldn't just leave her alone, they'd send me to my room and say, "You wouldn't understand." But I never stopped trying. At night, I'd sneak into her room just to talk, even though she'd always push me out with tears streaming down her face, begging, "Please don't let them see you here," while pointing towards the ceiling. That's when I noticed the small red light blinking in the corner. They'd installed cameras to watch her at night, and if I ever tried to enter her room during the day, my parents would appear within minutes. One evening, I heard our parents talking in hushed tones. "The deprogramming is working," Mom said with satisfaction. "She's finally breaking the addiction." I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what they'd done to my sister. I waited until our parents were distracted and cornered her in the kitchen. "What did they do to you?" I whispered urgently. "What was the facility for?" She looked around nervously, making sure we were truly alone. Then she leaned in close, and what she told me changed everything. "I was playing League of Legends 18 hours a day," she whispered. "I was peeing in bottles so I wouldn't have to leave my desk. I failed every single class last semester because I couldn't stop playing." I stared at her in shock. I'd never even seen her play LOL before. "That's it? Video games?" She nodded miserably. "The facility was a gaming addiction rehab center. The video calls are to make sure I'm not playing. I'm not allowed to touch any electronic device without supervision for 6 months." I believed her because things were easier that way. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Until a week later, when I needed my purple hair clip for picture day. Kesha had borrowed it months ago before everything went bad. I waited until she was in the shower, one of the few times she was allowed privacy, and slipped into her room. That's when I caught sight of a small leather diary shoved behind her bed. The last page she wrote was dated from 8 days ago, written in Kesha's shaky handwriting. Day 64. I told her the League of Legends story like Mom instructed. She believed it. "I'm so sorry, Millie." My name. My hands went cold. I flipped to the start of the journal, with diary entries from before the facility. Most pages were torn out, but one entry remained, dated 3 days before Dad caught her in the hallway. When I'm scrolling, I can forget what happens when Uncle Monty visits. It's the only time my brain goes quiet, the only time I don't feel his hands all over me. But Millie told me to touch grass and Mom went crazy. She said if I'm so glued to my phone that even my 11-year-old sister is making jokes, people will start asking questions. They're taking it away tomorrow. Suddenly, it all made sense. I was still reading when I heard the floorboard creak. "You weren't supposed to find that," my mom's voice bellowed behind me. She snatched the diary from my hand so fast I barely saw her move. "This is private medical information," she said, her face getting red. Treatment notes from her therapy that got mixed up with her regular diary. She stuffed it into her pocket while I just stood there frozen. "You had no right to read this." I wanted to scream that she was lying, but the way she was looking at me made my whole body go cold. Dad appeared in the doorway and Mom showed him the diary. "She was snooping," Mom said. They both stared at me like I was the problem. I backed away toward the door, but Dad blocked it. "We need to have a serious talk about boundaries," he said. They made me sit on Kesha's bed while they lectured me about privacy and trust, and how sick Kesha was. The whole time I kept thinking about Uncle Monty's name in that diary. When they finally let me go to my room, I heard them whispering in the hallway. That night, I woke up to drilling sounds. Dad was installing something on my door while Mom held a flashlight. "Go back to bed," she said when she saw me watching. I realized it was a lock, the kind that only locks from the outside. Dad tested it twice, turning the bolt while I was still inside. "This is for your own safety," Mom said. "Until Kesha is better, we need to make sure you don't disturb her recovery." The lock clicked shut and I was trapped in my own room. I pressed my ear against the door and heard them doing the same thing to Kesha's room. The next morning they let me out for breakfast. That's when I saw the new cameras in the hallway. little white domes pointing at both our bedroom doors. Dad was on his phone showing Mom something. "See, I can check from work," he said, tilting the screen so she could see. Real-time footage of both doors. Keisha sat at the table just staring at her cereal, not eating, not moving. The bell on her ankle made a tiny sound when she breathed. "Eat your breakfast," Mom said to her, but Kesha didn't respond. At the school, I couldn't think about anything except that diary entry. Uncle Monty's name kept repeating in my head during math class. My teacher, Mrs. Murray, asked if I was okay because I hadn't turned in my worksheet. "I'm fine," I said, even though I wanted to tell her everything. But then I remembered Dad saying he could watch the cameras from his phone, and I got paranoid. What if they had ways to watch me at the school too? What if they found out I told someone? I kept my mouth shut. When I got home, Kesha was sitting in the living room with Mom right next to her on the couch. The TV was on, but nobody was watching it. Kesha still had the gloves on, and when she shifted position, the ankle bell jingled. I tried to catch her eye, but she looked away fast, staring at the wall instead. "Go do your homework," Mom said without looking at me. I went to the kitchen to get a snack first and noticed they'd removed all the sharp knives. At dinner, I decided to test something. "Oh, Uncle Monty called last week to say hi," I said, watching Kesha while I said it. Her whole body went stiff like she'd been shocked. Her fork fell onto her plate with a loud clatter. Mom's head snapped toward me. "He's been traveling for work," she said quickly. "Won't visit for a while." Kesha's hands were shaking so bad she couldn't pick up her fork again. Dad reached over and moved her plate away. "You're excused," he said to her. She got up and walked to her room, the bell jingling with each step. That night, they locked me in my room at 9 o'clock. I lay in bed feeling sick about everything. The touch grass comment kept playing in my head. If I hadn't made that stupid joke about her being on her phone too much, Mom never would have freaked out. Mom never would have taken her phone away. Kesha never would have needed the phone to forget about Uncle Monty. Through the wall, I could hear Keisha crying, these quiet little sobs that went on for hours. I wanted to help her, but I was locked in. I pressed my hand against the wall between our rooms and whispered, "I'm sorry," over and over, even though she couldn't hear me. The next day, I started keeping notes hidden in my math textbook. I wrote down everything weird that happened, using the back pages where nobody would look. I noted that Kesha had a panic attack at 7:43 p.m. when Dad mentioned a family reunion. I wrote how Mom and Dad whispered urgently in the kitchen at 10:15 p.m. I documented when Dad checked the camera footage, usually every 2 hours. I needed my own evidence because nobody would believe this without proof. On Thursday, when I took out the trash, something colorful caught my eye in the garbage can. It was a pamphlet, partially burned around the edges. "Digital Wellness Retreat for Gaming Addiction," it said on the front. The address was 4 hours away, and when I checked the dates, they matched exactly when Kesha was gone. But whole sections were burned away, and other pages were missing. Someone had tried to destroy it but didn't finish the job. I stuffed it in my backpack before anyone saw me. Late that night, I couldn't sleep and heard my parents talking in their room. Their door was cracked and their voices carried down the hall. "We need to keep Monty in the loop about the situation," Mom was saying. "He's family. He deserves to know what's happening." Dad agreed and said something about being careful at the next family gathering. "Can't have her making a scene," he said. My stomach dropped because now I understood what they were really protecting. It wasn't Kesha they were trying to help. They were protecting Uncle Monty from getting in trouble. They were protecting themselves from people finding out they knew. The lock on my door clicked open the next morning, and Mom stood there checking her phone, probably looking at the camera footage to make sure I'd stayed in bed all night. At breakfast that Saturday morning, Mom poured orange juice and mentioned real casual that Uncle Monty would stop by this weekend to drop off some old furniture from Grandma's house. Kesha's face went completely white like all the blood just drained out of it. She pushed her chair back so fast it scraped against the floor and mumbled something about feeling sick before rushing to the bathroom. Dad followed right behind her, and I heard him testing the doorknob to make sure she hadn't locked it. I picked at my scrambled eggs while listening to Kesha throwing up in the bathroom and Dad standing guard outside. Mom kept eating like nothing was happening and told me to finish my breakfast. Later that morning, when Mom was on the phone with her friend talking about some church thing, I found Kesha alone in the laundry room folding towels with shaking hands. She grabbed my arm hard when she saw me and pulled me close. "Stay in your room when he comes," she whispered fast. "Lock it from inside and don't come out no matter what." Her eyes were wild and scared like a trapped animal. Before I could ask why, Mom's voice got closer and Kesha let go of my arm and went back to folding like nothing happened. The whole rest of the weekend I kept thinking about what she said and how scared she looked. Monday at the school, I tried to focus on my math worksheet, but my mind kept going back to Kesha's face when Mom mentioned Uncle Monty. During reading time, I walked up to Mrs. Henderson's desk and opened my mouth to tell her something was wrong at home. Nothing came out though, because how do you even start explaining cameras and ankle bells and uncles who make your sister throw up just from hearing their name? I stood there for like 10 seconds with my mouth open before asking if I could get a drink of water instead. At lunch, I tried again with the lunch monitor, and then during art class with Mr. Rodriguez, but each time the words just wouldn't come. Finally, during last period, I asked if I could see the school counselor about stress from grades, even though my grades were actually fine. Mrs. Henderson wrote me a pass, and I walked down the empty hallway to the counselor's office feeling like I might throw up too. That evening when I got home from the school, Kesha was getting ready to shower and took off her gloves to grab clean clothes from her dresser. That's when I saw the bruises around both her wrists, dark and yellow-green like old bruises that happened weeks ago. They went all the way around like someone had grabbed her really hard and wouldn't let go. She saw me looking and quickly pulled her sleeves down to cover them, shaking her head at me to stay quiet. Mom was in the hallway and could probably hear everything we said. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and couldn't stop thinking about those bruises and how Uncle Monty was coming in just a few days. My stomach hurt from worry, and I kept seeing Kesha's scared face when she told me to lock my door. Around midnight, I made a decision that I needed help from an adult who wasn't my parents. Tomorrow at the school, I'd tell the counselor everything, even if I was scared, and even if I didn't know the right words. Saturday came too fast, and I woke up to the sound of a truck pulling into our driveway around 2 in the afternoon. Uncle Monty's voice boomed through the house when Dad opened the door. That fake happy voice adults use when they're pretending everything's great. I crept to the top of the stairs and watched him give Mom and Dad these big hugs like they were all best friends. He had his usual too big smile that never reached his eyes and was laughing at his own jokes that weren't even funny. When he reached out to hug Kesha, she took 3 steps backward until she hit the wall. Her whole body went stiff and blank like she wasn't even inside herself anymore. Mom apologized for what she called Kesha's behavioral issues from her gaming addiction recovery. Uncle Monty said something about teenagers being difficult and laughed again. Watching Kesha stand there like a statue while he talked, I remembered that line from her diary about scrolling on her phone to forget what happens when Uncle Monty visits. Now seeing her in real life trying to disappear inside herself while he stood in our living room, I understood what she meant. She was trying to go somewhere else in her mind where he couldn't reach her. My stomach started hurting for real then. Sharp pains that made me double over. Mom noticed and felt my forehead and said I could go lie down in my room if I needed to. I went upstairs and closed my door, but didn't lock it because I wanted to hear what was happening. Through the floor, I could hear Uncle Monty's deep voice talking about football and his job and some fishing trip he went on. My parents laughed too loud at everything he said like they were trying extra hard to seem normal. Nobody mentioned that Kesha hadn't said a single word since he arrived. About an hour later, I heard footsteps running up the stairs and then the bathroom door slamming shut. Mom's angry footsteps followed and then she was pounding on the bathroom door. "Kesha, you're being dramatic and embarrassing our family," she said loud enough for everyone downstairs to hear. Uncle Monty's voice carried up the stairs saying something about how teenage girls are so emotional, and then laughing like it was hilarious. I wanted to scream at all of them, but I stayed hidden in my room with my fist clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. Finally, around 8 o'clock, I heard Uncle Monty's truck start up and pull away. I waited another 20 minutes to make sure he was really gone before sneaking out of my room. Kesha's door was open, and she was sitting on her bed staring at nothing with the ankle bell still jingling every time she moved. I carefully unclipped the bell from her ankle and set it on the nightstand. We sat together on her bed, not talking, just breathing and being close to each other. She reached over and squeezed my hand once, really gentle, before I had to clip the bell back on so our parents wouldn't know. Monday morning came and I dragged myself to the school feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My eyes kept closing during math class and I couldn't focus on anything the teacher was saying. The counselor, Ms. Romero, walked past our classroom and saw me through the door window with my head down on my desk. She knocked quietly and asked my teacher if she could borrow me for a minute. We walked down the empty hallway to her office and she closed the door behind us. She sat in the chair across from me instead of behind her big desk like most adults would. Her voice was soft when she asked if everything was okay at home. Something about the way she said it made my chest feel tight. She told me I looked really tired and upset. She said we could talk privately anytime I wanted and that her office was always open. I wanted to tell her everything right then, but the words got stuck in my throat. The next day, I went back to her office during lunch. I told her my sister was sent away to a gaming addiction rehab for 2 months. I explained about the cameras in our house and how Kesha had to wear gloves all the time. I mentioned the bell on her ankle that jingled when she walked. Miss Romero listened without interrupting and wrote things down in a notebook. When I finished talking, she asked me if I felt safe at home. I didn't know how to answer that question, so I just shrugged. That evening, I was helping Dad clear the dinner table when his phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a text from Uncle Monty that said, "Glad we got that handled." She seemed better. My stomach dropped as I read it. Dad saw me looking and grabbed the phone really fast. He shoved it in his pocket and told me to finish cleaning up. His face was red and he wouldn't look at me. Later that night, after everyone went to bed, I snuck into Mom's room while she was snoring. Her laptop was on the nightstand and still logged in. I grabbed it and tiptoed back to my room with my heart pounding. I searched for the digital wellness retreat where they supposedly sent Kesha. Their website said they only did 30-day programs, but Kesha was gone for 2 whole months. The dates didn't add up at all. I kept searching and found nothing about any red rooms like Kesha had written about in her diary. The facility looked more like a summer camp than a treatment center. I closed the laptop and snuck it back to Mom's room before she woke up. The next morning, I found a sticky note shoved under my bedroom door. It was in Kesha's shaky handwriting and said, "They won't let me tell the truth. Don't trust the story." My hands were shaking as I read it over and over. I hid it inside my math textbook with all my other notes about what was happening. I had a whole collection now of evidence that something was really wrong. At the school the next day, I showed Ms. Romero the sticky note from Kesha. I told her about the cameras watching us all the time and how my parents knew everything we did. She got really serious and set down her pen. She said she needed to make some calls right away. She explained that she was something called a mandated reporter. She asked if I understood what that meant, and I shook my head no. Ms. Romero explained that Child Protective Services would need to investigate our family. She said someone would come to our house to check on us, but that I would be safe. She scheduled another meeting with me for tomorrow morning to make something called a safety plan. She gave me her cell phone number and told me to call if I needed help. That evening at dinner, Mom announced that Uncle Monty wanted to visit again next week. Keisha's fork clattered onto her plate and she started breathing really fast. Her whole body was shaking and she couldn't catch her breath. Mom rolled her eyes and called it withdrawal symptoms from her gaming addiction. Dad had to carry Kesha to her room because she couldn't walk. She was shaking so bad that the ankle bell kept jingling the whole way up the stairs. I followed them and watched from the doorway as Kesha curled up on her bed. After my parents went back downstairs, I grabbed my notebook and wrote everything down. I documented the exact time her panic attack started at 6:47 p.m. I wrote that it lasted for 12 minutes before Dad carried her upstairs. I wrote down exactly what Mom said about withdrawal when it was obviously terror about Uncle Monty. I was building my own evidence file now with dates and times and exact quotes. The next morning, I was looking at one of the cameras in the hallway trying to figure out how it worked. I wanted to know if it recorded or just streamed to their phones. Dad came up behind me and grabbed my shoulder really hard. His fingers dug into my skin, and it hurt. He said if I didn't stop causing problems, they would send me to boarding school. He said I was making everything worse for our family. His threat scared me, but it also made me more determined to help Kesha. I knew Ms. Romero was making calls and that help was coming soon. That night, while I was brushing my teeth, something slid under the bathroom door. It was a folded piece of notebook paper with Kesha's shaky handwriting. The note said to meet her at 3 in the morning in the bathroom because the cameras didn't get checked then. I tucked it into my pajama pocket and set my phone alarm to vibrate under my pillow. My hands were shaking as I climbed into bed and pretended to sleep. The hours crawled by while I watched the clock on my nightstand. At 2:58, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway. The bathroom door was already cracked open, and I could see Kesha sitting on the edge of the tub. She turned on both faucets to cover our voices and motioned for me to sit next to her. Her whole body was trembling, and tears were already rolling down her face. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it so tight it hurt. She whispered that the abuse was from family, but she couldn't say who. They told her if she ever said anything, they'd send her away forever to a place worse than the facility. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe, but she kept the water running loud. I held her hand with both of mine and told her I already knew about Uncle Monty from her diary. Her eyes went wide and she shook her head frantically. She mouthed the words, "They're always listening," and pointed at the walls. We sat there for 20 minutes just holding hands while she cried silently. When we heard Dad's alarm go off at 3:30, we both scrambled back to our rooms. The next morning at the school, I went straight to Ms. Romero's office before first period. I told her everything about Uncle Monty and the diary entry I found. I told her about meeting Kesha at 3 in the morning and how scared she was. I told her about the cameras and the ankle bell and the gloves. Ms. Romero wrote everything down in her notebook and her face got more serious with each detail. She looked mad, but not at me. She said Child Protective Services would definitely need to investigate this right away. She picked up her phone and made a call while I sat there. After she hung up, she explained that a CPS investigator named Mr. Bass would come to our house within 48 hours. She said he was really good at his job and would help us. She told me I had rights and could ask to speak to him privately at the school if I needed to. She said telling the truth was brave and I was doing the right thing to protect Kesha. She gave me a hall pass and sent me to class but said to come back at lunch. 2 days later, I was doing homework when the house phone rang. Mom answered it in the kitchen and her voice immediately went cold and professional. She agreed to tomorrow afternoon for something and wrote it down on the calendar. After she hung up, she called Dad into the kitchen and they had an intense whispered conversation. I could hear words like investigation and allegations through the wall. Mom kept saying we needed to get our story straight. That evening after dinner, our parents sat us down in the living room. Mom's face was serious and Dad stood behind her chair with his arms crossed. She said a social worker was coming tomorrow to check on us because someone made a report. She said we needed to tell him about Kesha's gaming addiction and nothing else. She said if we told any other stories, our family would be destroyed, and it would be our fault. She made us practice what to say over and over. Kesha had to recite the League of Legends story until she could say it without crying. I had to practice saying I didn't know anything about any other problems. Mom said if we messed this up, we'd lose our house and have to live in foster care. Dad said we'd never see each other again if we didn't stick to the story. The next day, Mr. Bass arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes, but Mom never left us alone with him. When he asked Keisha about her treatment, she robotically recited the gaming addiction story. Her voice was flat and she stared at the wall behind him the whole time. When he asked me questions, I froze completely. My mouth went dry and I just nodded along with whatever Mom said. Mom answered most of the questions herself and kept steering the conversation back to gaming addiction. Mr. Bass wrote everything down, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. He asked to see Kesha's room and the cameras, but Mom said that was private medical equipment. After Mr. Bass left, Dad grabbed my phone from the counter. He said I couldn't use any electronics without supervision anymore. He said I was grounded indefinitely for bringing strangers into family business. He took my laptop and tablet too and locked them in his office. I was more isolated than ever, but I didn't give up. At the school the next day, Ms. Romero pulled me out of math class. She took me to her office and locked the door behind us. She said Mr. Bass told her about the visit and how Mom never left us alone. She coached me on how to share information safely without my parents knowing. She said Mr. Bass would try to see me at the school where my parents couldn't control the conversation. She reminded me that speaking up was the right thing to do even when it was scary. She taught me how to document things in ways my parents wouldn't notice. 3 days later, I was reading in the library when I felt something heavy in my backpack. Inside my history textbook was a folded piece of paper from Kesha's diary. This entry talked about a red room at the facility where they put her when she wouldn't stop crying. She wrote that they locked her in there for hours when she kept asking for help about what Monty did. My hands shook as I read her broken handwriting describing the cold concrete walls and no windows. I stuffed the diary page back in my textbook and went straight to the computer lab during lunch. The search results for behavioral modification facilities made my stomach hurt. One place in Utah got shut down after kids died in their isolation rooms. Another one in Montana had staff arrested for beating kids who wouldn't follow the rules. The red rooms Kesha wrote about were real things at these places where they locked kids alone for days without food or water. I printed out 3 articles and hid them in my binder. 2 days later, Mr. Bass called the house again, and Mom's voice went ice cold when she answered. He wanted something called a forensic interview for Kesha with a specialist who works with trauma victims. Mom kept saying Kesha wasn't stable enough yet and needed more time to recover from her gaming addiction treatment. I heard Mr. Bass's voice get louder through the phone until Mom finally agreed to think about it. The next morning, Ms. Romero pulled me out of PE and took me to an empty classroom where Mr. Bass was waiting with a notebook. He asked to see everything I'd been documenting, and I spread out all my notes on the desk. The timeline I made showing when the cameras went up, when Uncle Monty visited, when Kesha had panic attacks. He took pictures of every page with his phone and told me I was being incredibly brave. He said most kids my age wouldn't think to document things this carefully. Then he asked about the cameras in detail, and I drew him a map of where each one was positioned in our house. 3 days later, Mr. Bass showed up at our door without calling first, and Dad's face went red when he saw him. Mr. Bass said he needed to inspect the surveillance equipment as part of the investigation. Dad blocked the doorway and said the cameras were for home security, and our privacy was important. Mr. Bass stayed calm and said he could get a court order if necessary, but it would be better if they cooperated voluntarily. Dad slammed the door in his face. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath after that. Mom and Dad whispered urgently in their bedroom for hours. I heard Dad say something about lawyers, and Mom kept repeating that we needed to stay calm and stick to the story. Saturday morning, I woke up to Uncle Monty's loud voice downstairs. My whole body went cold. He wasn't supposed to visit for another month. I crept to the top of the stairs and saw him sitting on the couch talking about some work trip, while Kesha sat frozen in the chair across from him. Her eyes were completely blank, like she wasn't even there anymore. Her hands were shaking so bad she couldn't hold the water glass Mom gave her, and it slipped through her fingers onto the carpet. Mom rushed to clean it up while Uncle Monty laughed about teenage clumsiness. I ran back to the kitchen and grabbed the full pitcher of orange juice from the counter. I walked into the living room pretending to pour myself a glass, but tripped right next to Uncle Monty's chair. The entire pitcher dumped all over his lap and shirt. He jumped up cursing while Mom scrambled for towels. In the chaos, I grabbed Kesha's arm and pulled her upstairs to her room. I shoved her inside and locked the door from the inside using the little metal piece you can turn with a coin. Mom started pounding on the door, demanding I open it immediately. I sat with my back against the door while Kesha curled up on her bed shaking. We stayed there for 40 minutes until I heard Uncle Monty's car finally pull away. Mom was furious when I finally unlocked the door, but I didn't care. 2 days later, Mr. Abbas came back with official paperwork that Mom had to sign. It was an emergency safety plan that said Uncle Monty couldn't have any contact with Kesha while the investigation was ongoing. Mom's jaw was so tight I thought her teeth might crack as she signed it. Dad muttered something about false accusations destroying innocent families. Mr. Abbas made them both sign multiple copies and took pictures of the signatures. After he left, my parents turned on me completely. They said I was ruining our family with my lies and stories. Mom said Kesha had been getting better from her gaming addiction, until I started making things up and getting outsiders involved. Dad said if our family fell apart, it would be entirely my fault. They took away my library privileges and said I couldn't stay after school anymore. I felt completely alone, but I kept reminding myself that I knew the truth, and that's what mattered. 3 nights later, I found a folded paper under my pillow when I went to bed. Kesha's handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. Uncle Monty hurt me, with his actual name written out. Then underneath, she wrote that she was sorry she couldn't protect me from him, and that none of this was my fault. She said I was the bravest little sister in the world for fighting for her when nobody else would. I sobbed into my pillow reading it over and over. The next day at the school, I showed the note to Mr. Bass during our meeting. His face got very serious as he read it, but then he explained something that made my heart sink. Without Kesha directly telling him or another professional what happened, there were limits to what he could do legally. The note was important evidence, but the system moved slowly and needed more than notes to take major action. He promised he wouldn't give up on us, though, and said sometimes these cases take months or even years. But that didn't mean we should stop fighting. The next week, Mr. Abbas called to schedule the forensic interview for Kesha at a special center downtown. Mom's face went tight when she heard the date, but she couldn't refuse without looking suspicious. The morning of the interview, Kesha threw up twice and her hands shook so bad she couldn't tie her shoes. I helped her with the laces while Mom watched from the doorway with her arms crossed. Dad drove us to the building, which had tiny rooms with cameras and microphones everywhere. Mr. Bass met us in the lobby and explained that only Kesha could go into the interview room with the specialist. Mom started arguing that Kesha needed support, but Mr. Bass said it was protocol to prevent coaching. Kesha grabbed my hand so hard it hurt and whispered she was too scared to do this alone. I told her I'd wait right outside in the lobby the whole time and squeezed back. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she'd try to be brave like me. I told her she was already the bravest person I knew for surviving everything. The interviewer came out, a woman with kind eyes who spoke softly to Kesha. Mom tried to follow them, but the interviewer firmly said parents had to wait in a different area. For 3 hours, I sat in that hard plastic chair watching the clock tick by. Mom paced back and forth making phone calls while Dad stared at his phone. Every few minutes, Mom would mutter about false memories and coaching by outsiders. When the door finally opened, Kesha looked completely drained and pale, like she might faint. The interviewer spoke quietly to Mr. Bass for several minutes while taking notes. She said there were significant concerns based on what Kesha disclosed, but that Kesha couldn't talk about everything yet. Mr. Bass nodded and wrote things down in his folder while Mom demanded to know what lies Kesha had told. The interviewer said she couldn't share details, but the investigation would continue. 2 days later, Mr. Bass came to our house with official paperwork that Mom had to sign. It was a formal safety plan that banned Uncle Monty from any contact with our family. Mom's hands shook as she read through the pages asking what evidence they had. Mr. Bass said the forensic interview raised enough concerns to warrant immediate protective measures. The plan said Uncle Monty couldn't visit, call, text, or communicate with any of us in any way. Mom had to sign it in front of 2 witnesses that Mr. Bass brought with him. The safety plan also required regular check-ins from CPS and mandatory therapy for Kesha starting immediately. Dad kept saying this was destroying an innocent man's reputation, but Mr. Bass stayed calm and firm. The next part made Dad really mad because CPS ordered all cameras removed from our bedrooms and bathrooms. Mr. Bass walked through our house with a technician who took down every single camera. Dad argued they were for home security, but Mr. Bass said children deserved privacy in their own rooms. He said the surveillance was harmful to our well-being and had to stop immediately. That night, I lay in bed without the red light blinking at me for the first time in months. I could actually change clothes without wondering who was watching through the camera. The next morning, Dr. Fleming came to examine both of us as part of the investigation. She checked us over carefully and asked gentle questions about our health and stress levels. She documented that we both showed signs of extreme stress, including weight loss and sleep problems. Kesha had been pulling out her eyelashes, and I had bitten my nails down to nothing. Dr. Fleming took photos of everything and made detailed notes in our files. She referred Kesha to a trauma specialist who worked with abuse survivors. She also recommended therapy for me to process everything that had happened. Having an actual doctor write down that we were traumatized felt like proof that this was all real. A few days later, while sitting on the couch, Kesha reached over and took my hand without the gloves on. Her skin felt warm and soft after months of those horrible fabric gloves. We didn't say anything about what happened, but just sat there holding hands. It was such a small thing, but it meant everything after months of not being able to touch. The next evening, I saw Mom's phone light up with a text while she was cooking. The message preview showed Uncle Monty's name with a new number asking to meet secretly. Mom picked up the phone and stared at it for a long time like she was thinking about it. Right then, Mr. Bass called on the house phone to remind her about the safety plan. He said any violation would result in potential removal of children from the home. Mom deleted the text and threw her phone down on the counter looking angry. But the next week, I caught her typing something on her laptop late at night. When she saw me, she slammed it shut, but I'd already seen Uncle Monty's name on the screen. The next morning, I called Mr. Bass from the school office and told him what I saw. He came to our house that afternoon for a serious meeting with both parents. He reminded them that any contact with Uncle Monty would violate the court order. He said if they broke the safety plan, we could be removed from their custody immediately. Mom's face went white and Dad's jaw clenched, but they both nodded and promised to follow the rules. During that meeting, Dad said something surprising to Mr. Bass about not knowing what to believe anymore. He said the whole situation was confusing, and he just wanted what was best for his daughters. It wasn't him admitting Uncle Monty did anything, but it was the first crack in his denial. Mr. Bass had him sign papers agreeing to supervised visits only if Uncle Monty ever challenged the order. Meanwhile, at the school, my grades had dropped from B's to D's because I couldn't focus on anything. Ms. Romero noticed and arranged for me to get extra support with my assignments. She got me extended deadlines and a quiet place to work during lunch when I felt overwhelmed. Every single day, she checked in with me and reminded me that none of this was my fault. 2 nights later, I woke up to screaming from Kesha's room and found her standing in the middle of her floor holding pieces of a broken gaming controller. She'd found it in an old drawer and smashed it against her dresser over and over until plastic bits were everywhere. Mom rushed in looking ready to yell, but the trauma therapist on the phone said this was actually good. that Kesha was finally expressing anger instead of keeping it all inside. Mom's face went tight, but she just swept up the pieces without saying anything. The therapist wanted to see Kesha twice a week now instead of once, and said breaking things was better than breaking herself. I helped pick up the smaller pieces while Kesha sat on her bed shaking, and Mom stood in the doorway looking lost. The next week, Mr. Bass called us into his office at CPS to give us an update on everything. He said the district attorney was still reviewing the case and it could take months before they decided about criminal charges. He explained that even if Uncle Monty never went to jail, the safety plan would stay in place and support services would continue. It wasn't the justice I wanted, but at least it meant Uncle Monty couldn't come near us. Mr. Bass showed us all the paperwork he'd filed and said he'd keep pushing for whatever protection we needed. 3 weeks later, we had this huge meeting at the courthouse with CPS workers, lawyers, and even a judge. They extended the safety plan for 6 more months, which meant Uncle Monty still couldn't contact us, and my parents had to keep following all the rules. Mom and Dad had to sign papers agreeing to attend parenting classes every week and go to their own therapy sessions. The judge looked right at them and said any violation would result in immediate consequences, including possible removal of custody. Dad's hands shook as he signed, and Mom kept clearing her throat like she wanted to argue but couldn't. The CPS supervisor said they'd be checking in monthly and doing surprise home visits to make sure everyone was following the plan. After that meeting, I found a folded note under my pillow from Kesha that made me cry so hard I couldn't breathe. She wrote that the grass comment wasn't my fault, and I was just being a normal little sister who didn't know what was happening. She said she never blamed me, and that my silly joke wasn't what caused any of this. I'd been carrying that guilt for so long, thinking my stupid comment had triggered everything, and reading her words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. I kept that note in my math textbook with all my other evidence and read it whenever I felt guilty. A few days later, on this really sunny afternoon, Kesha came outside and sat next to me on the actual grass in our backyard. We didn't talk about Uncle Monty or the facility or any of the heavy stuff that had happened. We just sat there feeling the sun on our faces and the grass under our hands. She picked dandelions and made a chain while I laid back and watched clouds. It was such a tiny, normal moment, but after everything we'd been through, it felt huge. For just that hour, we got to be regular sisters again without cameras or bells or gloves between us. That evening at dinner, Mom cleared her throat and announced she was taking a break from her brother and wouldn't be going to family gatherings if he was there. She said she needed space to focus on our immediate family and work on herself. She didn't admit he'd done anything wrong, and she framed it like it was her choice. But it was still progress from where we'd been. I didn't trust her completely because I'd seen her almost break the safety plan before, but at least she was making some kind of effort. Dad nodded along but didn't say much, just kept eating his chicken and looking tired. After everything that had happened, I made a promise to myself that I would keep speaking up and writing everything down no matter how hard or scary it got. Ms. Romero told me during our last meeting that I was developing into a strong advocate and that my voice really mattered. She said not many kids my age would have been brave enough to keep pushing for the truth when adults were telling them to be quiet. I was starting to believe her even though some days I still felt small and powerless. She gave me a new notebook to keep documenting things and said she'd always be there if I needed to talk. 3 months after I found that diary in Kesha's room, we definitely weren't fixed, but we were so much safer than before. Kesha was seeing a real trauma therapist who actually helped her instead of trying to cover things up. The cameras were gone from our house and Uncle Monty couldn't come anywhere near us because of the court order. Mom and Dad were in their required therapy and parenting classes even though they went grudgingly. The safety plan meant CPS kept checking on us, and Mr. Bass called every few weeks to see how we were doing. Kesha still had nightmares and bad days where she couldn't get out of bed, and I still felt guilty sometimes about the grass comment even with her note. We had such a long way to go with healing and figuring out how to be a family again, but for the first time since this all started, I had real hope that we'd get through it together. I really appreciate you sticking with me through all the questions and curiosity today. It means a lot to share these moments with you. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.